Hello, I'm Pete Fisher, Chief of Police for the City of Fife, and this is Chat with the Chief. Today's episode will be on the state of the PD. This is an annual presentation that I do for our City Council that deals with important topics to our community and to our council. They include police use of force, police pursuits, citizen complaints, and other initiatives that occur throughout the year. So one of the things that really has been important since we've been here and we've tracked since I've been here is enforcement activity, use of force, and demographic data. And I think over the last couple of years that's been very a concentrated issue around the nation, and I think police departments need to be responsive to their communities and show that we are engaged in constitutional policing. And so we do that in a number of ways. And I think you're aware probably more than other places that our demographic data really doesn't represent our city, right? It doesn't represent our actual population or what our demographics are. But it's a starting point. We can use this as a reference year to year to see how we're doing in our enforcement activity and our use of force activity. And what you'll see is the majority of our enforcement really involves non-residents. And again, that shows us that we really can't use demographic data as a sole basis to gauge how we're doing in regards to bias-based policing. And I will point out that in 2021, we had a pretty significant jump in calls for service. We went almost to 20,600 calls for service. And so that was a large jump from 2020. And then one of the things we looked at is use of force, and I think it's very important to note that we require officers to report all uses of force, and we track those. And so out of those 20,575 calls for service, only 94 incidents resulted in force application, with 120 people experiencing force. And of that, we had about 250. And so if I can explain it so it makes sense, because the numbers can kind of get out of whack, is, well, 94 and 120. Well, if I stop a stolen car with 4 people in it, and I have 2 officers, that's 8 uses of force with 4 people. And so it's just a matter of the number of applications, de-escalation tactics. And so one person could have multiple uses of force without actually being contacted. So a draw and direct, a taser, we're never physically touching them, but there's multiple uses of force, and we track all of those, which is why the numbers may be a little hard to follow. And then the other thing we do is we also track by race and sex of the subject on all force applications. Again, not ideal, but it is a way for us to make sure that we're not engaged in bias-based policing. And so when you look at this, we talked about that, 94 incidents, 120 people experiencing use of force, and a total of 251 applications of force. What you'll note is that out of that, only 10 subjects reported injuries. And our policy is if a person complains of an injury or there's a visible injury, our officers are required to call medical aid and get them treatment. And I do think that we want to point out to officer injuries, our officer injuries are low. And I think that is, one, due to the training that we do provide our officers, the de-escalation tactics and our defensive tactics training that we do provide. COVID kind of hurt us in that endeavor in that we didn't get a lot of hands-on training because we didn't want to potentially expose our officers to COVID. And so we are now just getting back into hands-on defensive tactics training. During the pandemic, we did a lot of video training and one-on-one with our defensive tactics instructors and our officers to make sure that we didn't expose the entire department to COVID. And again, as we look at injuries, we also track that by race and sex. And then, so I kind of want to cover this because if you remember, 2021, we had significant legislative changes on what officers could do in regards to police use of force. And I think our numbers point out a couple of things. One, we were very quick with our city attorney's office to provide quality training and interpretation of the laws that were passed and to provide good guidance and tools for our officers. And so when you look at a large increase of calls for service and the increase of violent crime that we saw in 2021 and the actual decrease in use of force, it means our officers were properly trained and responded well to what they were facing. And so as you would expect with the changes that were made during the 2021 legislative session, you would anticipate that use of force would go down, and it did in almost every areas, with the exception, I'll point out, the pepper ball launcher. We had 5, and the reason why we had 5 in 21 and none in 20 is the interpretation was that the 40 millimeter launchers we had really violated the law being military equipment, so we replaced those with the pepper ball launchers. And that really is a non-lethal tool that we use to the benefit not only of the officers but to our community. And so those upticks that you see in those areas show that officers responded to the legal changes and the policy changes that we did in response to those changes. I will say, and you're well aware, we do have one use of force that has not been reviewed yet. We did have a tactical response team call out that was outside the city of Fife that resulted in a shooting. That is still under investigation, has not been filed with the prosecutor's office yet. Once that happens, we will do the review just like we're required to, and all the ones that you see here presented before you. But we are, by law, restricted from accessing that information until after the prosecutor receives that report and makes a charging decision. And again, one of the other things we just started tracking, and again, I think it points to our ability to police in a non-biased manner, is in our use of force incidents, how many of those are a result of dispatched calls for service versus officer initiated, right? And what you'll see is out of all of our use of force, only 15 of those were self-initiated. Every other use of force was a result of a 911 call. And again, officers have no control over what gets dispatched or what they get sent to. And again, I think it's just another way to monitor how we interact with our community and those that we police. Actually, I'm going to go back, if I can manage this. And if you look at this as well, we do that for every tool and tactic that we have, both dispatched and self-initiated. At the bottom. And again, we talked about the large increase in calls for service from 2020 to 2021. We also look at our Group A offenses, and we do show that every monthly report we cover the top 8. And we did have some significant decreases in areas. We had a very large decrease in our rate of murder, sexual assault with objects. We had a large decrease in counterfeiting and forgery, a fairly large decrease in fraud, embezzlement. And you'll notice we had a large decrease in drug and narcotics violations and drug equipment. That was not because we had a decrease, that's because of the Blake decision. And so that affected how we dealt with narcotics related activity and violations. So that's why that number is there. Overall, though, with those decreases, we did have a 24% overall increase in other areas. And as you see at the bottom left-hand corner, that's really a trend that's been going since 17. We did have a dip in 18, and then it just started going up, which is what we're seeing consistently around the county and around the nation, unfortunately. What you'll see here is weapons used. We thought we'd show when we talk about the types of crimes in the Part A offenses, what we're seeing is the number one weapon is personal weapons, feet, hands, fists, and the next is firearms in regards to reported crimes. And then DUI arrests, you'll see a steady decline. That's for a number of reasons. In 2016, we did disband our traffic unit to move them over to patrol to help respond to 911 calls. And then we had the pandemic. And we stopped discretionary traffic enforcement to try to limit the possibility of COVID exposure to our police force to make sure that we had people available for 911 calls. And with that, the funding for the DUI patrols and the high visibility enforcement patrols went away. They now are starting to come back, so hopefully we'll see those numbers start to uptick in 2022. And again, this is a slide you're very familiar with. We do this at the monthly PD every month. And what you see almost across the board is there's a fairly large increase in a number of the areas. Commercial burglaries, DV-related calls, motor vehicle thefts. Residential burglaries was actually down. Let's see if I can move this thing because it's hard to see. Shootings, a little bit up. Shots fired calls up significantly. And our vehicle recoveries are up significantly, which is a good thing since our motor vehicle thefts are up as well. Vehicle pursuits, again, you'll remember, well, since I got here, we've had a very, very restrictive pursuit policy, and so the changes that the legislature made in 2021 had very little effect on the Fife Police Department, with the exception of having a supervisor having to authorize prior to engagement and had probable cause. And so it was a small policy change for us. It was pretty easy for us to comply. And we do track those and report those. And just like use of force, anytime an officer is involved in use of force or pursuit, they must complete a separate use of force or pursuit form. That gets reviewed by the officer's first line supervisor. It then goes to the operations assistant chief for review, then the support services assistant chief for review, and then ultimately I review before they get put into the annual report. And so we have a pretty robust review and oversight, not only for pursuits, but for use of force. And so we had 6. Our first one, the officer deployed the PIT and took the subject into custody. PIT stands for Pursuit Intervention Technique. That's where you come up, tap the rear of the car, it spins out, you block it in. 3 were canceled by the officers, which is a good thing. It means they understand our pursuit policy, because when you look to the right, stolen vehicles is not a crime we can chase for. And so officers should not engage in those. And so when we say they terminated, they tried to stop a stolen car, it took off, they did not initiate, but we call that a termination or not engaged in pursuit. One pursuit we did shut down. It ran over a large rock and became disabled, and so we were able to take them into custody without really pursuing. And we do have one pursuit that resulted in an outside agency employing deadly force at the end of that pursuit. That investigation has been filed with the prosecutor's office, but the prosecutor has not made a determination on that case. And so once that case is determined one way or the other by the prosecutor's office, we'll do our pursuit review then. Again, we're hampered by the same restrictions as we are for our own officer-involved shooting, because it is part of that criminal investigation at this point. Complaints, we do document and investigate every complaint that's filed with us. If you look to the right, I talked about the significant increase in calls for service, yet you'll see our complaints actually went down. And what's even better is our sustained complaints went down. Sustained means that the alleged misconduct actually occurred, right? So that's really not a great finding. If someone said the chief was rude and that's sustained, that means that I was rude and I violated our policy. Again, we saw a downturn in our internal affairs investigations. An internal affair investigation is misconduct that would result in discipline greater than a letter of reprimand, right? So a suspension or termination, that gets assigned to an internal affairs number. We had 9 of those. 5 of those were sustained. I am happy to report most of those are being tardy to work or late to work or missing an off-duty assignment, not gross major misconduct. 3 were unfounded, which means it did not happen. And 1 is what we call not sustained, and that just means there was not enough information to prove or disprove the allegation. And I think if you look over at the bottom at our sustained complaint per calls for service, it is very, very, very low. Kudos to council, because you did authorize the purchase of this virtual reality training simulator after we were not successful getting the WCIA grant. Interesting enough, tonight while I was waiting to present, WCIA sent out a questionnaire about wanting to use and have access to a virtual reality training platform. So it is a great tool. Sergeant Goff did the research. He found this one. We actually got the first in the state discount. So we got about a $125,000 system for $62,000. And we were the first one in the state to use it. We just put our entire Citizens Advisory group through the training on shoot, don't shoot, and it was very enlightening for what officers have to go through, and it was a good exercise. And again, we will invite council if you would like to attend through Jennifer. We'll coordinate with our office and get you through that, because it is very good training. You actually can load up any type of environment you want, a school, a bar, a grocery store, outside. You can set any number of parameters and you can respond immediately to an officer's communication. So you can escalate or de-escalate based on how effectively the officer is communicating. It's a great tool. And again, 2 great programs for our community. This was the 8th, 2021 was the 8th year for our Thanksgiving Day meals. We did have I think COVID impacted us quite a bit. We did deliver 112 meals this year for Thanksgiving. And a big shout out to Too Busy to Cook, because they do donate their staff and their time to help us prepare those meals and get them ready for delivery. And this was also the 4th annual Shop with the Cop event. And working with the schools, where it'll help 35 children from 11 different families. And the big sponsors for that was Lexus of Tacoma from the O'Brien Auto Group and Larson Mercedes. And I'm going to read this because I don't want to miss anybody. And we'd like to thank Thanksgiving Day Meal Delivery Program donors, Too Busy to Cook, LLC, Systems for Public Safety, Costco employees, and Shop with the Cop sponsors, Larson Automotive Group, Larson of Fife, and partners of Walmart of Bonnie Lake, GLM Charters, Pizza Time, and all the volunteers that made this event possible. It's really a great event, and it's great to see officers getting to hang out with families and children and not being engaged in enforcement activity, just getting to know each other. And Chat with the Chief was a video series we started in May, and in 2021 we did do a number of topics. We did a segment on street racing, police reform and accountability measures. I did do 2 on homelessness and trespassing, 1 for public property, 1 for private property. Also did a Q&A with the mayor. That was an interesting one where we talked about all the legislative changes and the impacts that was going to have our policy in our community. And then we did one on the less lethal munitions that we employed once we had to take the 40 millimeter less lethal launchers out of circulation. And I will like to say, you know it as well as I do, that our department is very involved in our community, and our community is very involved in our department. And one of the prouder groups that I have to establish is our Citizens Advisory Group. And it's a group of citizens made up from all walks of life, all races and ethnicities and life experiences. And they come in and look at our policies, and we present this data, and they ask questions, and they make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. But more importantly, it builds relationships in the community that if we do have something that's questionable, that we have that support in the community and we build that trust. And so it's really kind of a, I don't want to call it a stopgap, but maybe an external group that works on making sure we're doing what we're supposed to be doing for our community. And I think they do a really good job of pointing out to our community that we do. And then our strategic planning committee, this is again a committee we formed when I first got here. They meet 4 times a year. They set out our goals and initiatives for the upcoming year, and they evaluate our mission, vision, and values every year, and they update it as they see fit or as we need to. And as you remember, November 2021, we had the big DOT homeless camp cleanup on 62nd Avenue, 12th Street, and 8th. A lot of work by a lot of partners in the city, Pierce County Sheriff's Office, WashDOT, Great Lakes Mental Health, and that was an initiative that was very successful. Which moves me into my last section that's not really state of the PD, but part of our monthly update is a progress report on the state of our homelessness here in the city. And again, this is a team effort. We do meet every Monday. Our deputy city manager kind of leads that charge, and we've had a great deal of movement here in the last few days. It didn't pop up. So this is a map that we worked with David Sherfield in GIS to help us build. We have applications on our phones where we can actually go to the site, geolocate individual camps, take pictures. We can calculate the number of people there, ask if they need services, what type of cleanup or resources are needed to kind of mitigate or abate that area. And I'm not going to try to guess the numbers. If I will try to guess. We have about 48 general encampments throughout the city, which represents over 200 people. To date, we have cleaned up 39 sites, representing, I believe, about 233 people. And we will be adding to that significantly over the next coming days and weeks. And so this is kind of our report card that we keep track of what we're doing. On your left, you'll see city. In the middle, you see WashDOT, and lastly, tribal. City is kind of what our priority projects are, and we talk about these every Monday. Interurban Trail, there were 3 or 4 vehicles that were regularly living there. They had to do a fairly stout cleaning to remove the smell that was around the trailhead, and we have abated that. There is no longer people living there. Our Parks Director has worked with getting gates installed, which should be happening shortly. And the police department graveyard crew will be locking up the interurban trail, so we won't have to deal with long-term issues with people using that for homeless camps. 3400 block of 12th is a very large camp. We did just place some blocks out there, and we are working with Colin to clean that up, and that is a work in progress. We were just out there yesterday. And there is some city property and private property and tribal property, and so community development did send compliance letter to the private property owners. The tribal property owners already secured their area and fenced it, so that's already been abated. 20th Street Drive is another one that is by Pax Air and underneath the I-5. There was a large area there that has been cleaned up. There's no more vehicles, and WashDOT just finished, I believe this week, placing the last of the blocks there. So there's a few areas there that they could still park if they wanted to, but we've been patrolling that pretty regularly, and hopefully that is an area that will not come back. And then Wapto Oxbow is still a project or a priority for the city, and we continue to discuss that and come up with a timeline. In regards to WashDOT, 20th Street Drive, I would consider that one complete. The Valley Avenue, we were out there today and posted it today. I won't get ahead of myself because I have a couple more slides. High-Lobos, we spent the last 2 days on High-Lobos. Hopefully by the end of the week, that will be completely cleaned up and no camps will be on the High-Lobos or Milgard parks, which I'll talk about earlier. And we do have a number of homeless camps on tribal property, and so I work with Chief Duenas to keep him up to date to where those are and how they can address that and help us address those. And so we talked about 20th Street Drive. Here's the timeline. The best news is it's cleaned up. There's no homeless there. The trash has been cleaned up and it's been blocked off, and so we're gonna call that one complete. High-Lobos, we went out Monday and Tuesday. They are still in the final phases of removing some campers. My guess it'll take us probably the rest of the week, and then that will be completely emptied and cleaned up. Our deputy city manager did work with private security, and so we have security out there 24/7 now to make sure that it does not repopulate, and the PD will partner with that company to ensure it stays that way and they do so in a safe manner. And in Valley Avenue South Side, we went out there today and posted it, and we will go out next Monday and we will start removing the homeless camps on the south side of Valley. And so because of the size and the scope of that, that could be a project that's at least a week, if not 2 weeks long. My understanding is once that's done, they're gonna move over and post the north side, and that will be the next priority. So I'm hoping by the end of October, beginning of November, both sides of Valley will be cleaned up and be free of camps. As you can see, accountability and transparency is important to the Fife Police Department and the City of Fife. I hope you learned a great deal about your police department and the level of professionalism that we have. I look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Chat with the Chief.